Oh, hello everybody, and welcome back to Samye Edinburgh, Kagyu Samye Edinburgh. And so we're going to continue with the Discovering Buddhism course. And before we start, we should say the Refuge Prayer and settle our minds and bodies in a good way to be open to receive the Dharma. So I'll say it in English first, and then we can all say the Tibetan phonetics together. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the noblest Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. Through the virtue generated by the practice of generosity and other virtues, may I achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. And so the Tibetan phonetics. O Sanje Chotang Suji Chonam La Changchu Padu Dani Chapsunji Dagi Jinso Jipe Sonamji Dola Pinchir Sanje Do Power Show Sanje Chotang Suji Chonam La Changchu Padu Dani Chapsunji Dagi Jinso Jipe Sonamji Dola Pinche Sanje Do Power Show Paden Soe Lama Rinpoche Dagi Chiwo Pende Di Shukla Katrin Chimpo Gone Jisungde Kusum Tuchi Ngudrup Sao Tu So. So in case you're wondering, that last prayer was to my root guru, to pray for his guidance. In fact, there's something else I want to explain. You know, when I first came in, I was doing the shrine things. I put, every time I come in, I make offerings. And there was a line in the prayer that referred to this. It says, through the virtue generated by the practice of generosity and other virtues. So this is the offering of generosity, is when we make offerings with our body, our speech, our mind. So this is not because the Buddha needs to have our offerings, it's really for us to cultivate generosity and gather the merit, the virtues from that. So I just thought I'd explain that. And the same is true of the prostration. So, you know, the Buddha doesn't need me to bow down or anything like that. I need me to bow down because helps to generate generosity. It also helps to reduce ego, which, let's face it, we could probably all do with. So anyway, now, on with the course. So the previous one, we're still part of Discovering Buddhism. So the previous part was the source, which dealt with the early life of the Buddha. So we're going to continue on from there. I think the source, it recounted the events of his life from the birth of the Buddha up to his enlightenment and the first teachings he gave on the Four Noble Truths to the four ascetics. So we'll continue the next part of his life, which we've called this second part of the course, Pointing the Way, which refers to his activity. And on one level, we're going to be looking at the subsequent events of the Buddha's life, whilst at the same time relating to it not just as some sort of historical story, but in terms of what we can learn from it and apply in our own lives. And that's actually the main thing that we have to take from this. This is what the Dharma is all about. It's the main point. So in discovering Buddhism, we're actually discovering ourselves. So the teachings of the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught to the five ascetics became known as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. They were the very first teachings, and therefore absolutely essential, because without the first one, there wouldn't be a second or a third one. So Dharma in this Dharma has quite a few meanings. It can mean the way things are, the way they are in reality. But in this kind of context, it means the truth of how they really are, which is synonymous with what the Buddha was teaching. The Buddha was teaching the way things are from his enlightened mind, when he'd woken up from the sort of half asleepness that we're all in, the kind of not really seeing things very clearly, quite confused. But when he became fully enlightened, then he could say exactly what was what. And so really that's what the Dharma is, the Buddha's teachings, which are synonymous with the truth. And so it was this first discourse that set in motion all the subsequent teachings that blossomed from that first one. And at that point he set off to spread the light of the truth of his teachings with the underlying wish to relieve the sufferings of all beings. That was his motivation. And to benefit them according to their capabilities. Obviously, people are at different levels and different sort of levels of understanding or of education. So he had to give them what was going to most benefit them. But this, the path of treading, if you remember the Four Noble Truths, it all points the way to the path of the Dharma, the path that we should take in order to cut the root of suffering, you could say, come out of the suffering. And so the path that he taught, again, to most people, it was all still part of the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. It was called the Noble Eightfold Path. And this was a sort of middle way between the extremes of self-indulgence, which you could say was somewhat could describe his life when he was in the palace, which was extremely luxurious, and the other extreme of self-denial, which would describe the life he led when he was with the ascetics before he got enlightened, and was really mortifying his flesh by hardly eating anything. So the middle way is between these two extremes, and it's a training in the way to uproot the causes of suffering. So it talks about behaving in the right way, for example, with one's body and speech and mind. So especially with the body and speech, we talk about ethical conduct. And so that includes right speech. One should train to have right speech. So speaking kindly, wisely, as one is capable of, not harshly or divisively. So right speech, right action, to guard one's actions, that one acts wisely and considerately, and right livelihood. So whatever one does for a living, one should make sure that it is not harming people or beings in as far as possible. So those three are to do with the ethical conduct of one's body and speech. And then in terms of one's mental development, there's right effort. So wherever one puts one's effort, it should be the right way of putting one's effort, that it's not going to cause problems or harm for anyone. Right mindfulness means we should be aware as far as we can be of what we're doing and not just sort of lackadaisical about things, but really conscious of what we're doing. And right concentration, which means the focus that we have, we can train through meditation. So that's to do with meditating regularly in order to keep our mind calm and stable, and that we can have right concentration, not be kind of unstable or just going hither and thither with the wind. And then the final two, the seventh one is right view. So we should work towards right understanding, right view of how things are. We're coming towards becoming as realizing our true nature. And also the eighth one is right intention. To have good motivation, the right intention to escape suffering, to to keep our vows not to harm any beings as far as possible. And that's all part of the compassion and the wisdom. So the right view and right intention is the wisdom aspect. So altogether, all of these eightfold things comprise the Eightfold Path, which the Buddha taught, excuse me, quite widely, because it applied to everybody, whether they were monastics, whether they were lay people, whatever kind of people. It was a very general teaching and very applicable in people's lives. So he would travel up with the bhikkhus, and bhikkhu means monk actually, but what it really means is it means beggar. So the ascetics, who were his first followers, became the first monks. And they took monastic vows, and they were devoting their life to the Dharma, so that it differentiated them somewhat from the lay people, who obviously had their families and everything like that to look after. Of course, they could still follow the Buddha's teachings, but as householders rather than as monastics. So the Buddha and his monks would wander from place to place, and they were called bhikkhus, which in Sanskrit actually means beggar. Because as they wandered from place to place, the Buddha would teach the Dharma, and the grateful recipients, whoever they were, whether they were holy people or just ordinary householders, they were very grateful for hearing the Buddha's teachings, and so they would give alms. They would sustain not only the Buddha but also his monastic followers. And so it was a kind of two-way benefit. And so in this way he would wander from place to place, benefiting beings as far as he could, and begging really for his food. It was, they would give alms. Now we have to remember here that the Buddha was actually born a prince. So just this very act of going from place to place with a begging bowl, after having been a prince in the palace with all the luxuries and everything that money could buy, but having left all that behind and chosen to devote his life to offering the Dharma in order to help beings, that really does speak volumes. That one act of leaving all that behind to become a beggar, a bhikkhu. And so for the next 40 years, he wandered from place to place, attracting more and more disciples as he went. And he spoke to people of every walk of life, from kings to paupers. Everyone came to hear him. And many of them decided to become ordained as monks. So they took monastic ordination, and the community of monks swelled, increased exponentially as he wandered from place to place, reaching people by spreading the Dharma impartially and universally. And eventually, in gratitude to his parents who had brought him up and given him the best start in life, he wandered back to his homeland and to the palace. And he returned to the palace and gave teachings to his relatives, who were absolutely overjoyed, of course, to see him. And although his own mother had died, his stepmother, who had largely brought him up, because his birth mother actually died not that long after the Buddha was born, so he'd actually been brought up quite a lot by his stepmother, who had married the king, his father. And so she was there, and his wife was there, his son, who by now was grown up. And so one of the quite amazing things happened is that his stepmother said, well, all this is very well, but what about us women? Is it possible for us to become nuns? What if we want to devote our lives to the Dharma and become monastics? Can we become bhikkhunis, is the feminine word for bhikkhu? And the Buddha considered this. Of course, he would have done it before, but India at that time was not the women did not have a great deal. But after he had this request from his stepmother, he granted it. He granted her request, and then in fact his own wife became a nun, and his son, who was grown up, he became a monk. So they went on to achieve high levels of realization. So let's just think about that, because we'll think about what it meant to be in India 2,500 years ago. So at that time, the predominant religion, and indeed society in general, was rigidly caste-based. And spiritual progress was not available to most people. You have the castes of the Brahmins, the priests, and then the kings, or royalty, you could say, the aristocrats. Those are the two upper classes, if you like. And then you had the merchant class, or professional people. Then you had the majority, who were the workers, the working class, you could say. And then you had the lowest class of all, which was the Dalits, who were the untouchables, and did jobs that nobody else wanted to do. But it was not only in this lifetime, people were kind of stuck in that caste, so that their whole families would be that caste. And then, you know, when they had children, their children would also be in that caste. So there was no way of getting out of it. They were just stuck rigidly in that. And so only the two higher classes, obviously the priests and the king class, the royal class, had access to spiritual teaching, spiritual attainment. And then only the males, not the females, not the women. Then here comes along the Buddha, whose message could not be more radically different. And he offered the Dharma to everyone, regardless of caste or class, rich or poor, male or female, gender, whatever. Race, it didn't matter. That was not a consideration. If they wanted to hear the Dharma, they benefited from it, he gave it. Well, this was wonderful. It was revolutionary and wonderful for most people, but maybe not so popular with some of the more narrow-minded people of the higher castes, who wanted to preserve the status quo and the power that they had, and the power that they had over the lower castes. So he wasn't entirely popular with some of them. Some of them were fine. He had kings who were becoming his followers, but some of them were really had their noses out of joint. And so the Buddha had enemies and people that were jealous of him, and his critics, and the haters of his day. You know, haters are not a new thing. These are the haters of his day. And in fact, even his own cousin, very jealous Devadatta, who was had always been jealous of him. And then when he became enlightened and had all these people following him, he was consumed with jealousy, to the point where he arranged to have the Buddha killed. It didn't work out. He even tried himself to murder him, and that also, fortunately, did not work out. But that's how things were. You know, it was not everybody's cup of tea, let's say. Of course, generally it was the priest caste who were the most put out and fearful about losing their position, their royal patronage. And so it was largely some of the priests who challenged the Buddha. And so the Buddha would engage in debate with them, because not only to persuade them of the error of their ways, and of the truth, but also because they were so powerful, all the people of that area where they kind of ruled, they had to follow what the priest said. And if the priest was leading them up the garden path, then all of those beings would suffer from that as well. So the Buddha did enter into these debates, and he won them over. Generally speaking, he won them over. Sometimes they would be more stubborn and say things like, well, if you were the really enlightened one, you could do miracles, and why don't you do some miracles? And of course, the Buddha could do miracles, but generally speaking, he didn't like to show off, and to sort of be like some kind of showman. But sometimes, as a last resort, he did do that if he felt that it was going to benefit the beings that were under the sway of these recalcitrant priests. And so he put these amazing displays of miracles, and yes, in that way they converted. They realized that he was speaking the truth and that he had great powers, and they followed him. So the Sangha of monks and nuns supported the lay community by offering the Dharma, whilst the devout lay community supported the Sangha by offering alms. And it was a system that worked really well. It was a radically new social order, completely different to how it had been before, because it wasn't based on how one was born or who one was, but rather on how one lived, how one behaved. In fact, and so it was a meritocracy, you could say. It was if you behaved well and you were devoted to the Dharma and you were doing your best, then you would progress accordingly. And it was very, very nicely illustrated by an incident that happened when there was a man from the lower caste, the lowest class, the untouchable caste, the Dalit, who had been a barber and who was absolutely taken with the Buddha's teachings and wanted to become a monk, and he did become a monk. And not only that, but he was so devoted to the Dharma, he really took it on board and made great spiritual progress. And the Buddha entrusted him with responsibility and of being the custodian of the Vinaya, which is the monastic rules and holy texts. So this ex-barber, the ex-untouchable, had now become a very highly thought of monk. Before that had happened, shortly after he'd first got ordained, though, there were other people waiting to get ordained the same day. So he'd got ordained. Now, some of the other people waiting to get ordained were actually the Buddha's cousins. They were all princes, very highly respected. But because the barber, the untouchable, had got ordained first, he was now a monk. So the Buddha insisted that they had to prostrate to the existing monks, which included the untouchable, the ex-untouchable. And so they all had to prostrate, the princes had to prostrate to the barber. And so I think that illustrates very well that he wasn't going, just because they were his cousins, he wasn't going to sort of make exceptions or engage in some kind of nepotism. And so, I think that illustrates it quite graphically. So basically, every word that the Buddha spoke and every deed that he did arose from his enlightened mind. So therefore, his entire life, from the moment he was born until he died, and indeed beyond, points the way. This is to show us what it's possible to do, what it's possible for somebody, who had a human life. Of course, he was an extraordinary being, but he was still a human being. And so it gives us such guidance. And his teachings arose completely spontaneously in response to those he was teaching. He didn't have to plan his lessons or have notes the way I do, or most people do. It just was completely like the the sun shining forth. It was a natural thing that came from his enlightened mind. And he just knew what was right for each person. In fact, it's said that he could give a discourse to a lot of people, and people would hear different things. They would take from it what was appropriate for them. This is one of the special qualities of the Buddha's speech. But of course, there was also certain presentations that he gave to some and not to others, because he had such a wide group of followers. So some of them were very highly on the road to enlightenment. Some of them were right at the beginning. So it depended who he was talking to. And so, for example, the discourses known as the Mahayana Sutras that compose the second turning of the Wheel of Dharma were originally transmitted in closed circles to those who were ready to receive them. Certain, probably mainly monks or people that had been, devoting their life to Dharma and were really ready. And so they were given in more sort of esoteric circumstances, you could say. Although after the Buddha died, they began to be taught more openly. And today you can find versions of many profound and very advanced Buddhist teachings in libraries, online, pretty much anywhere you want to look. And whilst that's good in some ways, it's not so great in others. It's a bit of a mixed blessing, because without the Buddha's discerning wisdom, it's rather like making medicines available to everybody. The Buddha is sometimes, one of the sort of metaphors we use is that the Buddha is like the doctor, the healer, the great healer, and that the Dharma is like the medicine, and we are like the patients. But if you imagine that you're making all the medicines available to everybody, it has its dangers, it could go horribly wrong. So we need, if not the Buddha, then certainly a good teacher, a good Lama who has our welfare at heart, so that someone who can prescribe the correct medicine for each patient to guide them along the way. And so it's very important to have someone who's a genuine Lama or teacher. Doesn't have to be somebody famous particularly, but it does need to be someone who is versed in the Dharma and who practices the Dharma, not just someone who knows it studying, but also who's practiced the Dharma and who has one's best interests at heart, and also is from an authentic lineage, genuine teacher. But what we can take from the Mahayana teachings is that it has at its foundation the first teachings. You could say it's built on, there would be no second turning of the wheel if there hadn't been the first turning of the wheel. And so it depends on the first turning in order to progress to the second turning. It's a bit like if you were building a house, you would have the foundations. You have to have good foundations before you can put the walls up. So that's just quite sort of practical metaphor. Don't take it too literally. But I'm just trying to say that it doesn't dispense with the first teachings of the wheel. It builds on them. And so it has those as its foundation, but it's more concerned with, whereas the first turning of the wheel is really more about one's personal liberation, how one has to behave and act in order to become liberated from suffering. And in the Mahayana view, which is the great vehicle, I mean, is one has fundamentally this motivation to do that in order to help all beings out of suffering. So it makes it a very vast motivation. And this applies whether one is a monastic or a lay person. You don't have to be a monastic in order to follow the Mahayana. You can be from any walk of life. But it means that one is motivated to liberate all beings, and one does this by following the path of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. The Bodhisattvas are those who followed in the Buddha's footsteps. So one takes Bodhisattva vows, motivated by the wish to help all beings. In fact, we cannot truly attain full enlightenment without both the wisdom and compassion of the Mahayana vehicle. Full enlightenment. Enlightenment comes in stages, but to have the full enlightenment like the Buddha had, you need to have both wisdom and compassion. Of course, we still have to start with ourselves. You could say if you want to be useful to people and helpful to people, if you wanted to stop them from drowning, you have to first learn how to swim yourself, isn't it? But even with that knowledge, we still can have that aspiration to help others right there from the beginning. We're doing this, we're having to work on ourselves in order so that we be in a position to be strong enough to help all other beings. So it's the biggest motivation you could possibly have. And the other one of the other main philosophical sort of points about Mahayana is that it also is concerned with the realization that everything exists in relation to everything else. So nothing has its own existence. It's empty of self-existence, empty of independent existence. That doesn't mean to say empty as in nothingness, but empty of existing on its own. So, for example, everything exists in relation to everything else. So, high exists in relation to low, or big in relation to small. If you have, for example, this is quite a small bowl, but in relation to my watch, it's quite big. So my small watch and the big bowl. But then if you think, okay, so the big bowl, but then in relation to the room that we're in, then that becomes small, which shows you that it doesn't have any intrinsic bigness or smallness. It's only in relation to other things. So that's a sort of crude way of putting it in a way, but maybe gives some idea. And so that everything that exists interdependently. It all depends on everything else. I think the best way to sort of get our heads around this is to maybe rest our mind in awareness, and let's just think about it in a way that we can just let go of our sort of too many words and too much thinking, and we can just settle our minds, and then we can just approach it in stages. So basically, you want to come to some understanding of the second wheel, the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, which is to develop our natural compassion, and with the wish to help all beings, and to cultivate our wisdom. So if you want to get into a good posture, straighten up your back. Okay, I'll just move this over here. Straighten up your back and imagine you're growing upwards towards the light. Rest the eyes, looking downwards, open, just resting. Relax your belly, relax your diaphragm. Allow them to fill and empty with each breath. So resting, body and mind together. Here and now. fully present in the present. Allowing the mind to clear, letting go of the usual habitual thinking, just let it settle and become clear like water that's been shaken up and muddy, and it settles and becomes still and clear. And now let's contemplate the core of the Buddha's teachings, that the causes of both suffering and of happiness are within the mind of each person. It's in our mind that we find the problems and also the solutions. And that everyone who has a mind has the capacity to free themselves from suffering and attain true and lasting peace and happiness. Have that potential. By training our body, our speech, and our mind, in the Noble Eightfold Path, we too can find relief from suffering. And inner peace. And relax the mind again, letting go of thinking and contemplation while retaining the awareness. Just let the mind rest in its natural state of awareness. And now let's examine, investigate the Mahayana understanding. The Mahayana view that all things are empty of independent existence. That is to say, everything is interdependent on everything else. Is this the case? We are all connected to each other, to the environment, to the planet that we live on, to the universe and beyond. Does this have truth or not? And let the mind rest again, non-referentially, just let it rest in its natural state, aware, spacious, limitless. Then let's examine, are we indeed all interconnected? And if we are all interconnected, what happens if we harm others? If we hurt them in some way? Does that hurt us too? Do we harm ourselves? Conversely, let's ask ourselves, well, what happens if we help others, if we do something good for others? Does that help us too? How do we feel? You can ask yourself these questions about other people, other beings, the environment, everything. What happens when we harm things or people? What happens when we help them? How does that affect us? Ponder which would be the intelligent course of action. Which would be likely to result in suffering, which would be likely to result in freedom from suffering. And let the mind rest again, letting go of the thinking and just resting in natural state of awareness. Clear, peaceful. So you see, the way of Buddhism demands that we use our brains. We have to use our intelligence as well as cultivating our natural compassion. Everybody has natural compassion. If you look at the way children behave, I mean, I know they can be little monsters as well, but mostly they have this natural compassion. We all do. But it's a question of cultivating, bringing it out. And the same is true of our intelligence. You know, even the Buddha had to work hard for enlightenment. It didn't just fall into his lap. So these are all things that we can think of and test. What happens if we do this? What happens if we do that? What will the likely results be if I do this or if I do that? Even in simple things, the main point of all the Dharma teachings is to apply it to your life. It's about us. It's not about passing a Dharma exam. You know, it's really about our lives, who we are, and blossoming into who we can become. And the Buddha, you know, we have to do it for ourselves. The Buddha couldn't wave a magic wand and say, boom, you're enlightened. If he could do that, he would have done it. It would have been a whole lot easier than wandering around sort of teaching people. But of course he couldn't do that. He could point the way. He could say, look, this is what I did and this is what you can do. And he could point the way and help very much in that way. But each of us has to walk the walk ourselves. Luckily we have the Buddha's way to follow, and not only the Buddha, but the ones who have already followed in his footsteps and become enlightened themselves, so we know that it's possible. And we have the map, if you like. We have the map. This is what this course is really. It's kind of like looking at a map. Obviously, we're not going into minute detail about the Buddha's teaching in one short course, and discovering Buddhism. We're looking at a map of Buddhism, if you like, but we're looking at with the idea of setting out on that journey. Before you set out on the journey, it's kind of useful to look at the map. And so, if we look over the Buddha's life and see how it, not just as some sort of historical story, but how it actually pertains to our own life and our own times, the problems we have now as individuals, as globally, the repercussions of our actions, good and bad, how it plays out, see how it works. That's the benefit of it, the reality of it, the life of it, is to see. Really take it on board to see, does this work, and if so, how does it work? Then we can really get somewhere. And so when we're looking at the map, it's like, you know, we've looked from to where we've come from to where we are now. We can also look to where we can go. Of course, we've not yet set out maybe on the journey, but we're looking to see, okay, well, I can go from A to B or A to Z, whatever, you know, and just get some sort of lie of the land, if you like, before setting out. And then we'll look at that in more detail in part 3 in a month's time. But I think you've actually got quite a lot to be going on with for now, so hopefully you've found something useful and that you've got something that you can work with and meditate on. This teaching, it'll be available to get at any other time, so if you want to maybe make a few notes, I probably forgot to say that, but I know when I listen to stuff I like to have a pen and paper ready and just a few key points that I think, I need to check that out. So you can do that and then meditate on those things and also see how they play out in your life, both as an individual and your family, the people that you know, and people in the world. Okay, so I hope you found something useful, and take that with you, and whatever wasn't, leave it here, and enjoy the journey. So let's first of all make the dedication of merit before we part company, and that's to share the merit of our practice with all sentient beings. So we're starting with this idea, we finish with this idea, so it's good at the beginning, good in the middle, good at the end. O sanam di tam che zikpani, topne ni pe janam pamche ne, jigana chi palav drukpai, si pe sole doa doar sho.